So in the big picture, what does LISC exist to do?
Yeah, so our mission as a community development financial institution is to help improve the quality of life in lower income neighborhoods. That's a pretty general statement, but there's a lot of history behind that. CDFIs, or community development financial institutions, were created to really drive investment in lower income neighborhoods that for decades and generations did not see investment the way other neighborhoods have. And there are a lot of structural issues around why that happened. There are federal policies that existed that explicitly discriminated against certain neighborhoods, and a lot of this has to do with race. And so our mission as a CDFI is to work to empower the nonprofits that are in these neighborhoods that have been neglected for a really long time, that are serving residents that have been neglected for a really long time, to help empower those organizations and those people to help improve their neighborhood.
Great. And that's a wonderful mission. It's a huge mission. How do you measure and track how you are doing at working towards that?
Yeah, so historically, a lot of the work in community development, because of this history of disinvestment and declining property values, has used as a measure increased property values as a way to evaluate whether or not programs have worked. So the way it's typically done is you take a baseline before the project or initiative started that looks at property values and what direction they were going. And then after the initiative has occurred, looks to see if there was a change. And typically you also want to have a control. So another neighborhood that maybe didn't receive that initiative but was still also in a place that had high poverty rates or high unemployment rates as well.
So measuring property value, is that the best way to do it? Are there alternatives? And does property value really capture all that you want to measure?
Absolutely not. I think property value has been used as a way that, it's data that can easily be accessed by researchers and evaluated. Going back to our mission, the quality of life in a neighborhood, that measurement of property values, there's an implicit assumption there that if there's a high quality of life in a neighborhood, it's going to be monetized and reflected and capitalized in the property value, which explains the property value measure. However, at LISC, we definitely don't look only at property values. We're interested in the outcomes of the residents in our communities. So we're looking at employment. We're looking at, we're really trying to create an environment where a mom can wake up in the morning and know that her kid is going to a child care center that's high quality, and can go to the job with a peace of mind that her family is going to be okay, and that she has a safe place to lay her head at night. So we're definitely looking beyond property values. That's just how community development has been measured in the past. So in terms of how we do that, it really depends on the project or program. If we're investing in housing in an area, we're looking at who are the families that are actually living in these units? What are their income levels? Are these housing units only available to people making 50 or 80% of the area median income, or are there opportunities for folks that are really struggling and maybe exiting homelessness to have a roof over their heads as well? So it really depends on the project or program once we get down into the metrics in terms of that.
And what kind of information do you typically collect from the folks that you work with, either through lending or through grants?
Yeah, so again, it does depend on the project or program. When we're looking at arts-based investments, it really ranges. It ranges from how many folks really attended an event, and then there's surveys that we get to get feedback on the event. Like, was this something that you felt was representative of your community? What does this make you feel about your neighborhood? So qualitative measures like that, but then also you can quantify these events as well. There's a good example in the Twin Cities that Springboard for the Arts did when a new rail line was being put along a major commercial corridor in the city. There was a bunch of construction. It caused a lot of disruption for the businesses, and Springboard went in there and basically created arts projects all along the corridor to really beautify this area at a time when it wasn't that beautiful because of the construction. And to evaluate their work, they looked at what they called earned media, which is media attention that they got from without paying for it.
So social media hits.
Social media hits. How many times was this referenced in articles? And they were able to track it along the corridor itself. And so that's a really good example of a cool way to measure an arts program in a quantitative way.
That's
A
interesting.
lot of the times we talk about the qualitative. Both are really important, and I just thought the Springboard one was kind of an innovative example.
So the way we evaluate is very project specific. Is there any sort of general framework that you give to folks or advise them to use when thinking about how to measure impact or change?
Yeah, and so this is general, and it might be basic, but it is kind of an important, logical way to think through a process. So kind of the first step is to really explicitly define your goal and your objective for either your organization or your program. And once you do that, to really attach both long-run measures for outcomes that you're driving towards and potentially outputs that you're driving towards, but also intermediate outcomes and outputs as well that will help you keep track along the way. I think the second step is to really establish a baseline. So once you've identified your objective, you create a baseline to understand where you're at today, currently. The third step is as you're implementing this program or as your organization is doing work in a certain area, is to look at those intermediate outputs and outcomes that you identified at the beginning to track your progress, to give you some current feedback on the direction that you're going. And then the final step would be to kind of, when the project's over, it's to kind of look at those long run outcomes and evaluate where you went from the baseline.